parents have anything to worry about?
I think so. Their children are doing things that they didn't do and they don't understand.
In the 60s, people took drugs to get out of their head, to get out of the constraints of society, and everybody was interested in finding out what life really is about. In the end, what happened as drugs became real popular is that psychedelic revolution became big business in the mass media.
The counterculture of the 60s exploded in full view of America, and once it exploded, the cat was out of the bag.
If there are 100,000 and 10,000 get involved in helping the other 90,000, that'll be their summer school. And they're going to all go back to their towns. And when they do, they're going to turn on everybody, and this thing is going to be all over the country.
And then when it happened, the establishment said, we can't make these changes. This threatens our very existence. We've got to do something about this.
The counterculture was free, and with its peculiar genius to turn everything into commodities, America commodified it. They turned it into records, films, fashion, magazines, because there's nothing that can't be bought or sold that can't be commodified in America.
It all moved in concert, really. The music industry, Hollywood, the media. Suddenly the psychedelic style began to spread.
1967 is called the Summer of Love. It was like mainly based in San Francisco and Los Angeles. Now that spreads all across America. Everybody had taken the psychedelic substances.
You're out if you're not in. A Be-In, the recurring theme of which is love one another. Seattle's Be-In is the latest chapter of fresh air frolics, perfect for group therapy. Cape Cod hippies conduct a paint-in.
In 1967, Be-Ins started cropping up in cities all across the United States, and you have what appears to be the worldwide flowering of a psychedelic culture. And the next critical factor is the role that pop music begins to play in all of this.
But what happened in the 60s was access to media like young people had never had before. And part of that was music. And so the messages in the music, many of them were subtly or not so subtly about drugs.
One pill makes you larger and one pill makes you small.
There were a number of bands that were fairly popular, but the first big hit band was Jefferson Airplane. They had a song called White Rabbit, which was an elaborate reading of Alice in Wonderland as kind of a metaphor for a psychedelic trip. And everybody thought, sure, yeah, that makes sense.
Just have some kind of mushroom and your mind.
We listened to a song like White Rabbit, and Grace singing Feed Your Head. To anyone who had a clue of what was going on, it was a clarion call.
Suddenly, on the airwaves of AM radio, going from coast to coast, were messages encouraging people to try drugs.
Some hippies believe the greatest allies they have in spreading dope throughout this country are the mass media of this country. Every day the radio plays drug music, Get Yourself a Little Green, Day Tripper. The teenagers get the message from these. They know that green is marijuana, a trip is a drug experience.
Suddenly there's a song on the radio, San Francisco, be sure to wear some flowers in your hair. And the next message goes out, everyone come to San Francisco because you're going to meet some very gentle people.
If you're going to San Francisco,
that kids all across the country got was that there's this great big party, and they'll take care of you. It will be this community where you will be embraced and loved and so forth. And the place was just inundated.
100,000 is a minimum estimate of what's happening. I think it will be a major historical event for this country, what is going to happen. San Francisco can, if you will, become a holy city.
All across the nation.
It just burst at the seams. There was just no way for it to assimilate all the people that were coming along. The result of it was it brought an immense amount of attention to the Haight-Ashbury. All of a sudden, every newspaper, every TV station in the country was flooding the place with reporters.
CBS News, without any flowers in its hair, is in San Francisco because this city has gained the reputation of being the hippie capital of the world. We're asking whether any central idea unites the hippie colonies in this and other cities, whether they have anything to tell us, why there is so much emphasis on the use of the drug LSD in their philosophy.
At this point, we're going to leave Golden Gate Park to go into and take a slight sojourn through the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco. It is the belief of the people who live within the area that we, the middle class or the upper class, have done a very, very poor job in running our government and our way of life.
We woke up one morning and there was the Gray Lines tour bus out in front of our house. I mean, then it got really strange.
You're going to be educated now.
Speed, combination of heroin and ephedrine, producing a speedy, powerful high. Split as a lead. Stoned, high as on LSD.
The thing exploded pretty rapidly after that. I mean, it was exhilarating to be there at the explosion, but it did explode.
We've got this survival school here where the new kids coming to 8th Street can really find out where it's at. Sex, drugs, VD, how to avoid getting busted for drugs, how to avoid gang bangs and pregnancy, how to exist without bread. We give out 6 months of experience in 3 days.
To say that the Summer of Love turned out to be a cruel sham would be one way of describing it, but, it's not as simple as that. First of all, you have this small neighborhood and 250,000 kids descending on it. And then you have crime, have the appearance of hard drugs, amphetamine, heroin.
How long is he going to be out?
I don't know. Depends on how much he did up. If that's what he did, I don't know. The ordinary seasonal supply of marijuana had dried up, and the scene had gotten so crowded that people didn't want to take acid and go out on the street. And to deal with the pressure of all these masses of people there, some people started taking speed. These guys basically kind of pushed everybody else off the street. I mean, who would want to be on the street with a bunch of crazy speed freaks running around? And I mean, crazy? I mean, when I moved to the Haight-Ashbury, you never saw cats on the street because speed freaks were catching them and eating them. That's kind of what happened.
When the truth is found to be lies, and all the joy within you dies, don't you want somebody to love?
The hippies weren't hippies behind closed doors. Hippies were hippies in plain sight. So they were a delight to a lot of the young people, but they came to the attention of the authorities immediately. The music was louder than anything we heard. It was more overtly sexual. It was always in the act of declaring itself. So they were something that conservatives and older people could use to scare the votes in. They seemed godless and communistic, and so politicians like Ronald Reagan were able to make hay by pitting themselves against the hippies.
We have some hippies out there in the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco. One of them the other day was giving some advice to his companions. He said, your parents take care of you till you're 21. The government takes care of you after you're 65. You've only got 44 lousy years. You got to look out for yourself. This fellow that was doing the talking had a haircut like Tarzan, he walked like Jane, and smelled like Cheetah.
But whatever they tried to do, you know, the establishment, would turn out to be like somebody trying to stick their finger in a dike that was about to explode.
Marijuana. I think it's great. First off, I've been smoking it about 10 years. I find that it's good for some things, not good for others.
There was a kind of mainstreaming of drugs in the 60s. It became something that was out there. But eventually, as the underground began to penetrate the mainstream, you know, there began to be a reaction.
The courts today are crowded with young offenders. Is the gamble of drug exploration worth this?
Hey, Jerry!
Police officer, open the door.
No one has the right to tell me what I can do with my own body, what I can eat, drink, or smoke.
If you don't like what these kids are saying and doing, then you go after the leaders. And who were their leaders? Kesey and Albert and Metzner and Ginsberg and Leary.
The kids who take LSD aren't going to fight your wars, middle-class, middle-aged, whiskey-drinking generals. They're not going to join your corporations, middle-class, middle-aged, whiskey-drinking corporation presidents. Something happened that would change Leary's life forever, and that was he was busted for marijuana. And from that moment on, he was vulnerable. And so the more the government came after him and tried to stick it to him, the more he felt the need to create this alliance, the psychedelic movement, as he envisioned it. He truly believed in the potential of the psychedelic experience, but there was also warfare. He was facing decades in jail.
Sock it to me. Come on. You can't hurt me.
Leary saw so much propaganda coming back the other way that I think he felt that it was all right to engineer some propaganda of his own.
Don't vote. Don't go to school. Drop out of school. Because school's education today is the worst narcotic drug of all. Our avowed aim is, of course, to bring down the American empire.
Tim Leary was busted. They thought, we'll bust the high priest, we'll throw him in prison. And the federal judge in California that judged his case called him, and I quote, the most dangerous man in America.
The polarization of the culture became much, much clearer. And when somebody like Paul McCartney, you know, starts talking publicly about taking LSD, musicians start getting arrested.
I was asked whether I had or not. And then from then on, the whole bit about how far it's going to go and how many people it's going to encourage is up to the newspapers and up to you, you know, on television.
You got to pick up every stitch. Must be the season of the witch. Must be the season of the witch, yeah. Must be the season of the witch.
The most famous person I almost arrested was Mama Cass. They were in town, and there were a bunch of kids going out to see them, and my informant was one of them, and they were allegedly going to have a party after the concert, and they were going to be giving acid to everybody, and I just never got it to the party. Had I would have been the first one to arrest Mama Cass Elliot.
Must be the season of the
I think what they're worried about is an entire alternative set of values that is being offered that negates most of their set of values. I'm talking about the power structure here.
There was a very clear sense of us and them. And eventually you have things like the Doors are going to perform Light My Fire on the Ed Sullivan Show, and they get asked to delete the word higher.
1967. Ed Sullivan was the #1 show in America and one of the only places to see rock and roll. Light My Fire is the #1 song in America, and the Doors are invited. 15 minutes before showtime, somebody comes into the dressing room and says to us, we have a problem, boys. network won't let you say higher on national television. And Jim said to him, what are we supposed to say? And he looks at Jim and he said, well, you're the poet. Why don't you come up with something? Wire, flyer, and Jim's about to hit the guy. And I grabbed his hand and said, no, for God's sake. So I said to the man, okay, listen, here's what we're going to do. We will change the lyric. And he said, okay, I knew you were the sensible one. That's good. He walks out the door. Jim and John and Robbie come to me and say, we're not changing the lyric. I said, exactly. Well, sir, it just came out. Ed Sullivan wanted you for 6 more performances. You'll never work the Ed Sullivan Show. What do you think of that? And then Jim looked at him and said, hey, man, so what? We just did the Ed Sullivan Show.
Well, the media blows up the counterculture because the counterculture was news, and the media is in the business of news. But when it became really big news, and then everybody jumped on the bandwagon, then it became a problem for the authorities, the status quo. Because a lot of what was happening in the counterculture was actually illegal.
Shows like Dragnet became perfect for exploiting the drug culture. Dragnet was being produced at the same time as the hysteria about LSD was peaking. So there are episodes of Dragnet that are ripped right from the headlines. The episode of the Blue-Faced Boy was ripped directly from the Watts acid test.
Dragnet, which is probably the most famous anti-drug television show. It's very funny to watch them now because they were so stilted and they were so self-righteous. You know, it was kind of disinformation, and everyone grew up laughing at it. See, that's what told you that drugs were okay.
These rumors about LSD, you would stare at the sun until your retinas burned out. It caused gruesome chromosome breakage and caused people to have horribly deformed babies. Evil! 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 Come on! What Dragnet did was it took every hysterical myth about drugs that had been around since the 1930s, slapped it onto the psychedelic culture, and just magnified it 100-fold.
Don't you people know where your baby is?
Jane, where's Robin? Robin!
There's a whole other thread to this story, which is that the explosion of interest and use of marijuana and psychedelics had an enormous impact on the burgeoning anti-war movement. The anti-war movement was reaching a crossroads in 1967. The war was escalating. There was something like 500 servicemen coming back in body bags every month. And the whole thing began taking on this dire sense of an apocalypse. In the wake of the human being, there emerged a contingent of psychedelic activists who were determined to rescue the anti-war movement from what they saw as the boring and predictable tactics of the old left.
Political pigs, your days are numbered. We are the Second American Revolution. We are winning. Yippee!
I think the anti-war movement would have happened without drugs. I think drugs would have happened without the anti-war movement. But together they were sympathetic partners.
There are things to realize.
The action that was planned for the first mobilization, the MOB as it was called, was designed to be something called the levitation of the Pentagon. The idea was the Pentagon was a symbol of evil. The demonstrators would join hands around it, and through chanting and all sorts of supernatural powers, they would lift the Pentagon off the ground and exorcise the dark forces from it. How psychedelic is that concept?
Thousands of demonstrators opposed to the Vietnam War assembled in the nation's capital for a mass protest. Some 400 demonstrators are arrested.
Flower power really began on the steps of the Pentagon. These people showed up at the demonstration with these masses of flowers, and they ended up in the barrels of those young soldiers on the steps of the Pentagon. Those were the images that went around the world.
Come on, people now, smile on your brother, everybody get together, try to love one another.
This whole sensibility of the flower as this symbol of what this movement was supposed to represent came directly out of the psychedelic experience.
The political energy of the 60s, you know, Vietnam protests, civil rights protests, began to converge with the kind of cultural utopianism of the counterculture, much of which was the product of drugs, you know, this sense of, you know, a new vision of a new world.
I think the drugs and the war were hand in hand in the sense that those that stayed behind were both unsettled, disturbed by what was going on, felt powerless, and one of the ways to check out in a very obvious and clear way is, you know, with your parents, but also with drugs. You literally are checking out. And I think drug use, we all find, when do you want to reach for that? Usually when you're feeling pressured and stressed and you can't escape your life. Well, right then, young Americans couldn't escape the reality that the older generation was sending them off to a feudal war.
Why shouldn't I smoke crack? Why shouldn't I live now and have all the fun I can? If I don't get killed in the war or by the big bomb, all I can look forward to is making money like my father, and I know he isn't happy.
In their gut, the policymakers, the two things they were afraid of was this is becoming a white problem, and this is leading to kids being against what we believe, which at that time was the Vietnam War.
This year I will propose a Drug Control Act to provide stricter penalties for those who traffic in LSD and other dangerous drugs with our people. The time has come to stop the sale of slavery to the young.
Lyndon Johnson made the decision that marijuana use equated to anti-Vietnam. So it no longer was, what is this drug marijuana? What does it do? How should we handle it? It was, they are the enemy.
Right now, it's time to pick up the dead.
For that whole sense of we're going to stop the war and we can do it, that's 60s. I think the beginning of the end is in 1968 at the Democratic Convention.
There were reports in the underground press that LSD would be put in the water system and threats of disruption of the city itself. Things such as moot-ins, public fornication, and so forth.
Despite the behavior of Chicago police, yippie spirits remained high.
It was